My name is Lauren Richardson, and I'm with Growing Gardens. I'll tell you all a little bit more about that in a little while. How many of you are already interacting in urban agriculture in some way or involved in it? A lot of you. Great. Good. This should be a good conversation. I'm looking forward to it. There will be a couple of points throughout the conversation where we'll stop for a Q&A, so if you can hold on to your questions for that, that'd be great, but we'll do it throughout the talk. And I think first things first, we want to start by introducing everyone. I'm going to let Catherine start. This is Catherine Long Gates and Tabor Ward from Mountain Flower Goat Dairy. I'm Lauren again, and have at it.
Well, thank you for coming to this, and yeah, it looks like we're preaching to the choir here, but that'll be good, because then we can share, and I definitely am somebody that would rather answer questions and have a conversation than give a speech. So, but I'm Catherine Long, and I'm a very lucky person because I was born here in Boulder. I've lived here all my life. My dad was born here. I live on the land that my family's farmed for about 100 years. There aren't many people probably in this room that have had that opportunity, so I fully acknowledge that I have a very different situation from most people that are involved in urban agriculture, and I don't forget that. I cherish that. My grandparents came to Boulder. My grandfather was like many people that came here in the late 1890s because he had tuberculosis, and that's brought a lot of people into our area because there was no cure, and they just sent people to a higher dry climate. And he had come from a farming background, and so he got into a business in downtown Boulder that was really more of a variety store, but it had seeds and bulbs, and he was able to purchase that in 1905. And he pretty quickly sort of started specializing in particularly the seed business, and a lot of that had to do with the fact that in 1908, Woolworths came to Boulder, and I relate that because it's really not that different from today. So Woolworths was the big box store of the time, and he knew that as a variety store owner, he was really going to have trouble competing with that. And so I think he looked at what would be a good niche and what was really more his passion, and that was plants. And particularly flowers. So we've always had a big emphasis on flowers, although for many years we did sell vegetable seeds. And this whole seed business was different than it is today. And he went around and the area and found people that had different varieties that did well. It was very regional, and then he helped develop that and create a seed source. And now, fortunately, we're finally moving back to that. So seeds and bulbs, particularly flower bulbs, gladiolas were actually our main crop for a long, long time. But they're pretty labor intensive and difficult to grow commercially without a lot of inputs. So we kind of transitioned into irises, which are easy to grow in our climate, take a lot less water, and that's what we specialize in. So we're a little different from a lot of people with a focus on food, but I always argue when people will say to me, why aren't you growing vegetables or whatever? For one thing, you'll hear about how there are vegetables grown on our land, but also we grow food for the soul, because flowers are also important. So I'm sort of the landowner representative here. We have this land that's been in my family. It's 25 acres of land, which at the time my grandparents bought, the original acreage in 1916 was north of town, as my grandfather put it, but we're actually just a mile north of downtown Boulder, and we're on Broadway. We're north of the North Boulder Recreation Center, if you know that. And we've stayed put and done what we've done, and then the town grew around us. So we're now a farm in the city. And we have our operation of growing irises, but we also are home to growing gardens, which you'll hear from Lauren. And some of that land actually that they grow on has been in community garden for now 40 years on our property. And then more recently, Tabor you'll hear from, who has a goat dairy. So we'll get into all of that, but that's sort of my background and the land that supports our different operations.
Hi, I'm Tabor. I'm the goat lady. I didn't have time to change, so you might actually have smelled me when you walked in the room. So we just started Mountain Flower last March, and I approached Catherine. I'd actually just finished law school focusing on food policy and urban ag systems, so I do have a little bit of an off-farm income, which you need for a goat dairy. But I approached Catherine and said, hey, what do you think about putting some goats on your property? The entire property is about 25 acres. The front half, adjacent to Broadway, is more private, and the back half is the community gardens. And we discussed about putting the goats in the community gardens, but as you can imagine, it's almost too public. Even though we're a community goat dairy, we also need the goats to be in a place where we have boundaries so people aren't constantly coming in. So for some reason, Catherine thought this was a great idea. And it works. It works with iris. There's some fallow land, so the goats sort of intergraze with the iris crops, and we don't need tons of irrigation. We will start growing some of our own alfalfa, but they're really good sort of mix with iris because we're putting back the inputs into the soil, and we're constantly putting poop back on the soil to grow more iris crop. So we've been there for about a year. Right now we just sold one of our goats, so right now we have 10 goats and 1 guardian dog. The neighbors were worried about predators coming to get the goats and instead eating their little dogs. So we got a livestock guardian dog who lives on the property with the goats, and that's one thing to think about with livestock is predation and how to handle it. So we have 10 goats. The city regulations say 2 goats per acre, and that's for any zone. Our property is zoned agriculture, but that's for residential, that's for, actually I don't know if it's for commercial, but that's the general Boulder city zoning, 2 goats per acre. So we can have up to 25 goats on our little 12-acre section, which is eventually what we will get to. And we produce raw milk. We were going to do cheese, but at this point I think we're just gonna stick with raw milk because it's doing great. And infrastructure-wise, that's like a $250,000 investment to put in the right cheese infrastructure. So to make money, you really have to have a herd of 100 goats to really pay that back. So we're just doing raw milk right now and breeding babies. We have babies every year. And we host educational tours and birthday parties and visiting hours. So it's really a demonstration farm as opposed to a commercial operation. But we do have a herd share where we board people's goats for, in turn, for giving milk to them, which is sort of a legal loophole in Colorado because raw milk is illegal to sell here. So the way you get raw milk is you buy a portion of the goat, and I keep the goat on the property for you, and you're basically paying a boarding fee for me to milk the goat and take care of the goat, and then you pick up your milk once a week.
Great. And I'm Lauren. I wear a few hats at Growing Gardens. I'm primarily the greenhouse manager there and the volunteer coordinator, but I also supervise a strong and mighty crew of interns that we have at Growing Gardens. I don't know how many of you are familiar with our organization. As Catherine says, the community gardens have been on her property now for 25 years? 40. 40 years, and the programming has been developed there for almost 20 years. It's 18 and a half now, I think. So the programs that we have there are the community gardens. We have 250 garden plots that are leased to individuals and organizations to grow food and vegetables and flowers as they wish. They're anywhere between 200 and 400 square feet plots. So they're not very large, but they produce an incredible amount of food. We also have the Children's Peace Garden, and that is for ages 4 through 9. And we do a lot of educational programming there for young minds to try to get them excited about where their food comes from, to help them understand how bees interact in our environment. We talk about pollinators and nutrition, and also just have an opportunity to get their hands in the dirt and to experience the outdoors as every small person should. We also have the Cultiva Youth Project, which is a program focused on youth leadership skills and also food and nutrition. And the idea is that we have between 50 and 60 teenagers every year who come for the summer and with their fearless leader grow vegetable crops for 60 CSA members every year. So they do all that on just a little over 2 acres, which is pretty impressive, and then have some more to donate at the end to the community food share and through Boulder Food Rescue. So we also have a horticulture therapy program that is largely focused on adults and children with both mental and physical disability to try to provide a space for them to get some time outdoors and also to have ownership over growing something and creating something of their own. So we have a few different partners in that program. It's a really great program that we run. We're going to talk a lot today about how how growing gardens fits into our community and some other ways that people are involved. So we'll get into that a little bit later, but that's the sort of general overview of what we do. I think at this point we want to sort of jump into one of the major topics that comes up for all of us as urban agriculturalists, and that's land use and land availability and land cost. That's something that is an issue for urban farming and growing across the nation, and we have a really good example of it here in Boulder. I'm going to give Catherine a chance to talk a little bit about how she views the need for land and her role in sort of trying to preserve that land and how that's going.
So as I mentioned, I'm lucky in that, you know, my family came here, established some farmland, and I should say that when my grandparents first bought property, it was only 3 acres. And even in 1914, when they first bought any of the property, our part of North Boulder was already pretty much small acreages, and it was people that had 3 and 5 acres. They had orchards, they raised chickens. There's a lot of what people, I think, envision now trying to go back to, but of course most land has been divided up. So we're just lucky that we kept doing what we were doing and kept a lot of land open and in agriculture, but it's always been a challenge as we got more and more urban. One of the big challenges came when our property was annexed into the city of Boulder, because the city of Boulder didn't have any provision for having agricultural zoning. That isn't generally something that a city thinks about, at least has in the past, because it's all about urban environment, which is sort of separate in most people's minds from the agricultural rural environment. So immediately our property taxes just went skyrocketing because we've been rezoned as residential. And so my father had to go and petition to have that changed and everything. So we are zoned agricultural, and for a long time we were the only land in the city of Boulder that was. There are a couple other little pockets. So that's one of the things, is getting people to realize that you can have ag land in an urban setting, and sort of changing your mindset and allowing regulations for that. The community gardens came about because people needed a place to grow their vegetables when they didn't either have land that, you know, they maybe lived in an apartment, or they had land that was unsuitable, was too shady or whatever. And so they actually went to the city of Boulder and asked for land to have a community garden, and that's how that got started. And there again, it was kind of like the city was like, well, that sounds okay, but we don't know quite what to do that. We don't even know what department to put that in. So they put it in Parks and Recreation, because that's a lot of times what municipalities think, well, it's kind of like a park, but it isn't like a park. Agriculture is different than a park setting and all that. So that's a lot of the challenge, is how do you work out the thinking and the regulations, the land use planning to allow for agricultural land, and then how do you make it sustainable as far as the monetary end of things. Long's Gardens that I manage is theoretically a for-profit business, but it's mostly a labor of love. But these 2 ladies are engaged in nonprofits. Somehow you have to have a situation where you can keep that land in an urban setting, and particularly in some place like Boulder, land values are very high. And so how do you allow for that? One of the ways is that we do have a very good system on our property taxes. When land is zoned agricultural, it's very low property tax. So that's one of the things that's allowed us to keep that land in agriculture and available for things. So you need to be sure that that's available to people. You can't have land priced at the values the taxes that you have for residential type land. I think, I've been lucky that we've been able to keep things in agriculture and available for people, and I want to see that stay that way. So as the hairs get whiter and all that, I realize that I need to think about how to keep that going. And so we've been engaged in a process of trying to establish a conservation easement on our properties so that it does stay in agriculture and is available for various programs on into the future. But for me, I'm not the sole owner of my property. There are other family members, some of whom don't even live in the state. And so there's value in that land, and they want to realize some value from it. And most of the value is in the development potential. So rather than places where you hear about people donating a conservation easement, we need to realize value, so we need to sell the conservation easement. And we've been working with the city of Boulder to see if they would purchase the conservation easement, and that's an ongoing process. But we do need to think about mechanisms for how do you allow for land to stay in agriculture, particularly in an urban environment where the pressure always is to develop it. And I've heard that for a long time. People would always look at our property and say, well, it's undeveloped. And I would think, no, it's developed. It's developed in a different way. But growing things and having people on the land is a different type of development, but it's not the way a lot of people would look at it. So, and they, you can get into an argument too about densification. That's a lot of things in Boulder and all that. And so they see a lot of land that could be put into housing or whatever. Well, that's the legitimate thing, but we feel like you also need this part of having land that can not only grow food, but particularly for our land, and I think for a lot of urban agriculture, it's for educating people about how to grow things and how to have that experience of being involved with the land. And it's so accessible to people rather than having something that people have to go out into a different setting. It's right there and easy to get to. So those are questions. If you have to first say that that's a value that's important to have urban agriculture, and then you have to work to find the mechanisms to make it feasible. So that's enough for me.
Yeah. And then the other thing, Tabor was talking about the other day was the other sort of land availability. Like there's land available out in Weld County, but what's the high cost of land as you use it here with other resources that are on the land?
Right. So as an emerging urban farmer, I'm sure we all have the same questions of, access to land, access to infrastructure, access to knowledge, institutional knowledge. And that goes for rural farmers too. And I think as a young person getting into ag, it's always great to find a mentor and somebody that has the institutional knowledge of the land. And if you haven't gone out and worked with somebody yet, that would be, in my opinion, the first thing to do. Somebody that can really teach you about the land, and not in like Alaska if you want to farm in Florida, somewhere where you want to be learning about it, and somebody who's willing to spend their time helping you learn about it. So the value of working with Catherine, who's been on the farm since she was raised on the farm, is there's infrastructure on the farm. She knows where the pipelines are. She has water rights on the farm. She can tell me about those water rights. She can tell me not to put a post in cement because it's easier to do it with rocks and soil because the soil's so clay. So there's things to learn from your mentor and from the landowner who's there. And we've been lucky enough to have this partnership as another entity, but volunteering on farms is always a great way to start, and just learning about your ecosystem you want to work in. So I would say that infrastructure, that institutional knowledge of the land you'll waste so much money and time on your own. And just the startup costs of a farm are overwhelming. So my other suggestion would be to have some sort of outside source of income when you start, or have a savings to start up, because like anything with ag, you have to put in a whole bunch and then it doesn't realize itself for a couple years even. So, and I agree with the zoning stuff, especially with animals, it's really important to think about neighbors. We do a lot of neighbor management a lot, because being in the city, you want your neighbors to like you. And so with animals in particular, we bring flies, we bring smells, we bring a barking guardian dog at night. And so there's ways to mitigate that by bringing the neighbors to the farm, building ownership with your neighbors. Say, let's have, when the goats came, we had like 2 meet the goat parties, so everybody felt like they were part of it. And that's been, our neighbors have been our biggest supporters, and I think that is so crucial in urban agriculture, to not make people upset. Give everybody your number, so if they're smelling weird smells, you know immediately and you fix it. Or if your dog is barking at 3 in the morning for an hour, they call you at 3 in the morning and tell you your dog is barking. So I think that those couple things in terms of the infrastructure, the cooperative nature, not just with our other farm entities, our landowner and our neighboring Growing Gardens farm, but also with your neighbors. That is part of the cooperative nature of urban ag. You're not just out there in Weld County in the middle of nowhere. Everybody is watching you, and they are. I mean, when I move the goats, our neighbors will come. I run across the field. Sometimes I trip and fall on my face. A neighbor will be like, "Sorry, trip and fall on your face." Everyone's watching, even when you don't know. So that is just something to keep in mind, is that in urban ag, you are sort of more of a centerpiece than if you're just out doing it somewhere in the countryside.
I think that being a centerpiece and that sort of vision for all to see is one of the most important parts of urban farming or growing food in a city, and it's the point. It's the whole point of doing this. Yes, the cost of doing this outside of the city would be less in many ways, but the opportunities that we're all talking about today is being there for all to see, is the fact that we are on the bike path. There's this trade-off where the cost of being in the city and having to interact with neighbors that sometimes don't agree with you is far outweighed, in my opinion, by the opportunities and the fact that the neighborhood kids can shovel the walkway and be a part of the Cultiva program and really be interested in what's going on with Yo-Yo the cat that's hanging out on the farm all the time. There's a certain engagement there that I think it is the opportunity in where our land is and doing urban farming. One of the sort of themes in Bioneers is how we are sort of living and evolving examples of Bioneers and how we're interacting with our communities. And I think that Growing Gardens is a really good example of that. It's something that over the years started as this idea from a few people who really wanted an opportunity to grow some food in their city. And it's just blossomed. There's all these different ideas that come to the table. We have, interns that come on and have a fantastic idea to start a children's garden because, well, wouldn't it be great to be able to reach out to children, and then that intern then becomes a staff member and makes this peace garden happen. And now we serve, 4,000 kids a year come through this beautiful but very small garden. And so I think that one of the excellent ways that Growing Gardens has been a part of all of this is that it's this example. It's this example of how people are having great ideas around food and agriculture, and it just keeps growing and building. And there's a lot of room for improvement. And I think one of our challenges is, and maybe you all can help us with this, is trying to figure out how to grow and sustain ourselves in a smart way. One of the things Catherine talked about was we are nonprofits, and so what does that mean? How do we make a living doing this? How do we support ourselves? How do we support the kids who are part of our programs? How do we make sure this can keep happening? Land costs, bringing it all back to that is essential. This would be impossible basically in the middle of any other city with the amount of land that we have to work with here. So I think creative ideas for how we can preserve our land and make sure that this is possible no matter what city you're working in is really valuable. I think we're to Q&A time, or at least the first of a couple. And so we'd like to hear what you guys are thinking, maybe what you're working on, how all this applies to you. Any questions you have? Yeah.
I'm curious. I'm from Fort Collins, and I attend Naropa University in the Environmental Leadership Program. And I'm working with a community group called the Fort Collins Local Food Cluster. which is multidisciplinary and including nonprofit, for-profit, city, county. And we've been meeting collaboratively to talk about ways to remove policy barriers and to promote urban agriculture. And one of the pieces that we've been talking about, you mentioned conservation easements on property as well as land zoned for agriculture. And so we just met with the legislators on Thursday to talk about a potential statewide bill going forward mimicking the California urban ag incentive zones to reduce property taxes on urban properties, so vacant lots as well as current farmers, with some parameters of not being more than 10 acres. You have quite a bit of acres on yours. But I'm curious if you feel like something like this would be effective for Boulder. I'm not as familiar with Boulder laws and policies around this. Do you think that would be a benefit to have property owners have a reduction in taxes if they were willing to grow food on that land for a period of years?
Well, I mean, I definitely do. I think there are people that at least, even if it's only for a part of the time or whatever, you mentioned vacant lots. I mean, for most people, particularly in a town like this, it would be, it's just impossible. The economics aren't there. They can't do that. There's so much tax to pay and everything. So if there was a way to lower that and an incentive type program like that, I would think that would be good. I mean, we went through a thing in Boulder just about the community gardens structure because there was a conflict that came up with people wanting to put in small gardens in basically what's the city right of way, that's, that section between the sidewalk and the street. And then people say, well, that's not allowed and everything, it's really city property, it creates hazards. So we went through a whole sort of creating community garden ordinance and all that, which trying to regulate things and look at what are the problems. So, anything in an urban setting, because we're all closer together, unfortunately always seems to require more regulations. But unless you can handle it, like Tabor was talking about, where you just try to communicate with your neighbors and work things out, So, but I think, yeah, the whole property cost kind of thing, anything that would help to incentivize people to allow their land to be used for some type of agriculture would be good. So when is that? Is it?
Well, the bill is just being drafted as bullet points. It's going to Janelle right now, and they're looking for a co-sponsor. But we could look at policies in Fort Collins to make it more effective for us. There's alternatives to doing this as a statewide bill, but there's a lot of benefits to doing it statewide. So the conversation is in the early stages, but it looks like they are going to move forward with this round. Each legislator can only take 5 bills, and so we're rallying the support in other organizations. Yeah.
I think the only thing I'd add to that, and maybe you guys have already done this or considered this, but I think anytime you want to enter something like that into legislation, as Catherine mentioned, there's so much that comes up around, vacant lot may be vacant, but the, woman who lives 2 stories up next door may not want that there or whatever. So there's a certain, obviously we support it, but I think that there's a certain benefit to sort of thinking about all the worst case scenarios first and trying to set up some sort of response, and sort of, even if it's, every city who takes on this, they would need a committee to make these decisions, to say yay or nay when it comes to what these vacant lots would be used for, because you are talking about a reduction in property taxes, which every city really loves a lot. So I think you gotta have all your answers ready to make that successful. Would be my only thought. And I hope it happens.
Catherine, you mentioned specifically an economic element to a conservation easement for your parcel. Mm-hmm. Are there any other hurdles, not economic hurdles, for conservation easements in Boulder?
Yeah, I think, well, in trying to sell a conservation easement and trying to have the buyer be the city of Boulder, that creates some interesting hurdles.
That was not there.
Yeah. And part of that is because the city's experience with conservation easements is on properties that are more rural in nature. And so it's hard for them to think that we sort of fit. So, and that's a big problem. I think, you know, we were going to talk about some of this maybe later, but just people's perception of what is agriculture. In our country, generally, we now have had this model of agriculture that's become sort of the corporate model, and people, and then the scale of it, people think agriculture is huge fields with acres and acres of corn and wheat and people raising cattle and things like that. So that's what they think of, and I've had lots of people say, you don't have a farm, or, you know, it might be nice if you had a farm or whatever, you know, and I say, but it is a farm. So you have a whole sort of what is perceived as farm, what is perceived as agriculture, and I think that's part of our battle kind of that we have to do is re-educating people. If we're going to have urban agriculture be successful, we have to think about a different scale and a different way of doing things. And one of the things in a conservation easement, usually it's pretty restrictive on any kind of development, which, you know, generally speaking, that's about houses or whatever. But when we just talked about how we would want to be able to have structures that would support the different agricultural endeavors on our property, like growing gardens, needs shade structures sometimes for kids. They need desperately to be able to have a bathroom, you know, instead of a porta potty.
Is so nice, though. It's large.
You know, and the classroom, because it's educational stuff. The city, they would look at that. That's development, and I'm like, no, it's only the infrastructure that's needed to support the agricultural endeavor. Well, you don't need all that because they're used to this big farm where there's still infrastructure, but it's spread out. So urban farming is generally much more intensive, and so it requires more infrastructure. And so it's just a lot of getting people to look at a different model of things. So
yeah, and we're trying, we are an agricultural entity, but the education piece, I mean, outside of what's needed for intensive urban farming, it's the education. It's having 3,000 children through the site every year. It's there's just, like you said, there's a lot that goes into that. Yeah. And there's a divide sort of in people's understanding of what's necessary.
And I think that's really important when thinking about your bill, is who is getting a tax deduction on their property? Is it just growing for home use? Do they have to hit a certain number of people that they're growing food for? What if all their crops died, and do they lose, like, what if they're really trying for something and it doesn't happen? Do they lose their tax incentive? And things like, what is the urban
There
agriculture?
is a way out, and we have put a minimum on there so that, you know, backyard gardens aren't included. It's kind of that in-between range where it's, you know, small farms and more CSAs and market gardens.
There was a hand.
Back to the question regarding the easements for Catherine, and to ensure that both of you can use Catherine's land for this. Does the easement have to be sold to the city?
no, but it's about the only buyer.
Okay.
So yeah.
There's an organization up in Longmont that does conservation easements. They buy and sell and connect investors and easement holders.
Part of the problem is that there are possible other partners, but pretty much everybody says unless the city's the primary one and on board, they don't want to look at it because everybody sees that as being the logical purchaser. So, but you know, that's not to say that's what's going to happen in the end. So, I don't know. And we've been at this for quite a few years, so maybe it isn't the right way. So, I'm open to different ways.
I think part of it too is there's always that. My idea would be that there would always be that thought in the back of your mind that if I'm the sole owner of this conservation easement, how many times a year am I going to have to battle the city on this, that, or the other thing? Does that not come up? Is the idea that if somebody purchased that conservation easement, that would be the end of the story, or is there still room to challenge?
Well, if the city purchased the conservation easement, then they have the control over, you know, making sure that the land stays in the uses that are spelled out in the conservation easement. I think the city's worry is that if they aren't the underlying landowner, then the conservation easement doesn't keep things as restricted as they like. They would like to have more ability to have control over it, and they worry what happens when my family is gone. So they've even said things like, "We'll just wait till you die." So that's nice. But that's just one council member. But
we've tried to hang him by his toenails, but it hasn't worked yet.
That's a legitimate concern. Although I feel like a conservation easement is a pretty sophisticated tool and can pretty well outline what should happen on the property. We've been working trying to say, well, maybe it needs to be accompanied by a management plan which has input from the city as the holder of the easement, whoever is the property owner, the neighbors, the tenants, whether it's Growing Gardens, Mountain Flower Dairy, whatever, that would be reviewed. Because like anything, those of us who are in things that are involved with nature and growing things, all that, we know things aren't static, they're always changing. So you need to have the ability to have things be flexible. And so if you had something where you're sort of reviewing, you have that underlying sort of restriction of the conservation easement, but you have a management plan that's maybe reviewed every 5 years or something to kind of say, are we headed in the right direction? Is this working with the community or the neighbors happy? You know, is this fulfilling what the vision that we have? So I think there's some kind of mechanism to keep it and keep the whoever, if it's the city that's the easement holder, have them have enough input that they feel that's public money that would go into that, buying that easement, and they do need to have some way to see that it's fulfilling what they paid for. So I think it's just a matter of getting there. And we've just had a little difficulty sometimes in keeping the conversation going. So.
Yes.
I see how, from what you said, Lauren, how your operation is nonprofit. But it wasn't as easy to draw the same conclusion, Tabor, from what you've said about why your operation is nonprofit.
Oh, because we have a big community engagement effort, and we outreach to schools. So we have kids coming on in the summertime all the time. So our basic mission is community engagement and outreach to do a demonstration dairy.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So.
Just I have two questions, if that's all right.
Sure.
To dovetail on that question, for the nonprofit sector, how, I mean, it sounds like you have some income from the goat rental market, or that business design that you spoke of, but Growing Gardens, I mean, is it grant-based? I mean, how do you pay for your income and all the other employees?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think, so we're always sort of struggling with how to do that best. So a lot of nonprofits, a vast majority of their incomes comes from grant funding, foundation funding, things like that. We actually are a little abnormal in that over 30% of our income comes from earned income programming. So that's our children's programs, like our field trips and things like that. The schools pay a per head thing to have the kids come in and be taught by our instructors. We also have a big plant sale in the spring, plug. It happens in May, and it's a really great fundraiser for us. That's a very large income earner for us for the year. And then we have a lot of individual donors. We have a great group of people who support us from an individual standpoint. The struggle we have is, I think, for someone like me who has never worked in it, this is my first nonprofit sort of experience. And I struggle, it feels so out of control, right? There's this idea that if you have a good business plan and you execute it, you can have a successful business. You can have a solid income. When you're basing your income off of even a large percentage off of grants, it can be so hit or miss. You know, our community experienced this flood this year, and right now, this year was a very successful year for us. We had a lot of community support. We had a very successful plant sale this year. We had a really good feeling year. We've got a great staff, and yet next year is going to be a struggle. When your community faces sort of that sort of crisis, the nonprofit world is the first to sort of suffer from that. So I think just not having a consistency there is hard for our organization. and more nonprofits are starting to go towards having some more stable income. We do have the CSA program that we run through the farm, but that essentially either just barely or not even covers the cost of paying for the youth salaries, because the kids that participate in that program do get a stipend, and some of them are even paid on an hourly basis. They're through the program for more and more years. So it's a great question. That's about where we're at right now. But as far as how to be sustainable and move forward, it's going to take a lot more, I think, of that sort of thinking creatively as a business, in addition to being a nonprofit, so that we can continue to support those the need-based community that we so desperately want to support.
And do you want to tell about what you do, like with kids and others who can't afford to come to the Peace Garden?
Yeah, so that's a really big piece, is that we have scholarships available for all of our programs, for all of our children's programs, where kids can come in if they don't have the finances to come, they get scholarships. I believe it's almost 30%, 28% of our participants in the Peace Garden programming are from a need-based background. We also have, I think that the Cultiva program in and of itself serves that purpose. We have this opportunity to let kids who normally wouldn't be able to afford to go to a summer camp, say, in the mountains or whatever. It's set up like a summer camp. They come and they have educational things, they have experiences with their peers, they get an opportunity to learn and engage with adults and kids their own age, and even to lead some of the Peace Garden programming. And I think that, and they're paid for it. And so the idea is that it doesn't leave anybody out. It's not exclusive in that way. We also donated over 3,000 pounds of food to Community Food Share and other area nonprofits this year, between our own fields and gleaning through the Cultiva project at the Boulder County Farmers Market. So, and I think something that's really rewarding about that is that the Cultiva students are the ones who really spearhead all of that. They get really excited about their community engagement. They want to be giving back to this community. They want to be learning about how to support the people in their community that need it most. And there's a whole sort of cycle that happens there also.
So, yeah, I just have one more question. I was wondering if you guys have been following what's going on in Detroit, which seems to be sort of on the forefront, pioneering urban ag. I'm pretty sure they have the highest percentage of acreage devoted to urban ag of any other city, and growing every year. What was that?
And foreclosures.
Yeah, and so that kind of ties into my question, which is that obviously the price of land and land taxes is a lot less in Detroit than it is in Boulder, but I wonder if there's any regulation or policy that city, is putting forth that could be a model for other cities to follow.
No, I haven't read specifically. I know that what you're referring to, but I don't know. It's a lot. My impression is that it's a lot easier to do something like that when property values are incredibly low, like they are in Detroit. My sense is that people probably aren't fighting them on that too much right now. Like, oh, there's 50 out of 70 vacant lots on this street. Sure, you can use one of those to grow some vegetables. But when things start getting denser and things pick up and things like that, that's, I think, when cities really start to need to put policy in place and sort of try to support them otherwise. But I don't know for sure.
They do have some very supportive policies in the city too, and especially when you're not dealing with things like water rights like we are here in the West, it's easier, but city water has been allocated. Urban animals have been, that's great, bring in your animals. And I also think that the city itself is doing some technical assistance to farms and farmers in the city to help grow food. But they have if you Google Detroit urban ag policy, the city is really on the forefront, like you say, with putting in things that make it easier, that reduce the barriers, allowing proactively allowing people to grow food in the median. And helping farmers understand food safety requirements for market gardens, and helping, because that's one thing when you start looking at urban ag and people are growing food in the median here in Boulder, what is the food safety requirement around something being built next to a road that dogs could pee on when they walk by? And so the city's really being proactive in helping people understand washing vegetables, handling vegetables in a city environment, which I think is important.
Yeah.
Big part of it.
Can you guys offer some links, or where are the resources where we can look at, can I have a goat? Can I have 2 goats? Can I have 5 goats? Can I have producer chickens? I mean, where do you get this information?
Digging. You know somebody like Tabor that can just study it forever.
There are some papers out there. There's one compilation of like a survey of city ordinances and policies, but you really got to go to your city code or your city planning office. Planners know it in the city office, but it's really a case-by-case basis. And I'd go to the city planning office. They'll know that information on zoning requirements and things like that. Or your city, most cities at this point, and in Colorado especially, because we're home rule and local control, you can't always trust what it says about the state rule, because the home counties and cities might have implemented something different. So really start with the city and then maybe look at the states, because if you look at the state of Colorado, we're a right to farm state, but cities can overrule that where it's not necessarily right to farm. So I would start with your city planning
Yeah,
office.
I found a lot of confusion when I tried to present about rainwater collection.
Well, it's because it's been hotly debated.
Yeah. Water law in Colorado.
Yeah.
Yet another challenge.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
To follow up on that zoning question, how is Boulder with residents or infrastructure on zoned land zoned for agriculture? Are you able to have residents on there? And you were talking a little bit about infrastructure.
Well, I mean, we live on our land, so yeah, we have a residence. And
It's limited though, right?
yeah, and actually, the land zoned agricultural in the city of Boulder, you can have 1 house per 5 acres, so that's the by right.
And the county and the city are much different.
Yeah.
Like in the county, I think you can have 10 goats per acre or something, so really huge differences. Yeah.
Before we get off the rainwater thing, do you know the regulations for that? I asked an environmental lawyer, and he said, put my rain barrels in the backyard.
Exactly.
I asked for permission, do you know? Does anybody
I don't know.
Is it hard to get a permit to do this? Or?
You can't do it. There are 2 legislative, I should speak for an attorney, but
Go
there are
ahead.
2 things that General Assembly has allowed. One is one small development in Denver. There's a test case, and the other is if you live outside of a municipal area and you have no access to municipal water, you're allowed to collect water for your own use. That's it.
So don't ask for permission.
We're not the only state in the United States that does not allow rainwater collection. The only state out of 50. But we also have the highest number of water attorneys per population.
Wow.
I've also been told by not an attorney, but that we can't hold the water, but
Right.
you can divert it.
Right.
Right.
So you can change the landscaping of your property to cool it someplace.
Yeah.
And the other one was that you couldn't hold it for more than 24 hours, so you should make sure your rain barrel has a leak.
Yeah. Well, I think part of it, you need to understand that all of that water is part of the whole hydrologic system, and so when you hold that water, you actually are interrupting, you know, what's been calculated to be the flow, because water, even that's diverted by ditches and everything and have water rights, we're not allowed unless you have a storage right to hold that water. It's supposed to be put on the land so that it is absorbed by the land, it returns into the groundwater and returns to the stream. And the water commissioners in our state who are charged with administering all of that, they actually take that all into account. And it does, yeah, 1 rain barrel doesn't make a difference, but if everybody was doing it and they weren't really applying it and everything, it does have an effect. So it sounds crazy, but if you have to look at the whole system, and unfortunately in Colorado, it doesn't work very well for the average, you know, homeowner that wants to capture their water. But so far, the water police aren't going to probably go after you, especially if you actually are using it. Because that's the whole thing about water law in Colorado is you need to be putting the water to beneficial use. So if you're actually using that and using it on your landscape and it's returning to the ground, you know, that's a good thing. So, yeah. But yes, we do have lots of water attorneys. So.
Anybody else? I think we can move on. There's sort of the next part of this conversation, I think, is that how do we move forward? How do you all engage? We started to talk about that a little bit. And it sounds, by the sounds of things, a lot of you are already in this. But there's more ways, I think, to continue to sort of talk to other people about what it is that we do and why it's important. And also just kind of this sort of next steps, that whole idea of sort of continuing the cycle and continuing to sustain what this is and grow it and improve it. How about land preservation? Catherine, where are we with all that?
Yeah, well, and I kind of jumped the gun on a lot of that.
No, that's all right.
Because that's always on my mind. But, you know, I think back to just changing people's thinking and changing your own thinking. Is it possible for us to sustain ourselves? Is it possible for us to support ourselves more locally? I mean, this whole movement of thinking locally. So if we're going to do that in some reasonable way, you have to have land to do that. Although, you know, there are other things out there. I've heard a little bit at this conference of different ways of growing things that are not needing as much land and all of that. But part of that, even if you're going to come up with technological fixes or whatever that are going to help you grow more food locally on less land, there's still value that is beyond growing food or growing things. And there's the whole community aspect of things and the whole thing that a lot of this conference is about, of how you work together and work collaboratively and stay connected to the natural world. So you got to have people going to growing gardens and mountain flower dairy, especially kids, and getting their hands in the dirt and learning how to take care of goats and having that interaction and having interaction with other people. You're going to have land to do that. So somehow we have to have it available and find mechanisms, like maybe it is a statewide thing to try and help find incentives. But we also have to recognize that there is value in that, and that having land that some people are seeing as undeveloped really isn't. It provides something that we all need, and there's things that are less tangible. Our land, because there's open land and it's in agriculture and people see it, actually provides things for people that never even set foot on it, and I hear that from people. It allows them to sort of slow down. I had a man years ago that said, when I drive by your place, I kind of take a deep breath. Well, I think all of us know that in our society, we need to kind of slow down and get back in touch with the whole natural world that we're part of. We're just a little part of it, and so we need to know about that. So having chunks of land that aren't man-made, overwhelmingly man-made environment, that's important. So it's part of it is just as a society, is that a value? If so, we need to support it somehow, and you can all do that by encouraging your government to have planning things that support that and have regulations that aren't being obstacles, that are actually being incentives for things. So that's sort of the big picture. Then you get down to sort of the nitty-gritty of, the little regulations and things that make it harder sometimes. And just because urban agriculture isn't sort of a common thing at the moment, so I'll let you get into more of the specifics. So.
Yeah, it's not a common thing at the moment, and I think part of my struggle with, I love goats, that part's easy. The hard part, they're so funny. The hard part is the trade-offs you make. And I think that that's also really important to think about. I can never travel anymore, ever, because goats need attention. We milk twice a day. They need you there in the morning. Like today, this morning I got there at 9 and they were all sitting there waiting, like, where have you been? So one thing we talk about, and Catherine really brought to light, is it's if you want a rural lifestyle with agriculture, can you really do that in a city? And do you really want a rural lifestyle where you're there and you're canning tomatoes and you're taking care of the livestock every day and you're not traveling and your friends are all going to get happy hour at 5:30 and you're milking goats till 8? So I think, with that being said, I think one thing that's really useful is doing these co-op models where you have chickens, but it's in a co-op. So you can take a break and somebody else can be there to be, maybe you have a dentist appointment and it lasts till 5:30, and if you don't put the chickens in the coop, they're gonna get eaten by raccoons. So I think having partners in your community to help you with these co-op models can be incredibly useful, get other people on board, your neighbors, your friends, and I think that way you can sort of mesh this rural yearning and this rural lifestyle and growing your own food, but also doing it in a way where you have a little freedom to travel and to see your friends and to, I think that's really important, especially for young people that are interested. I didn't think I personally realized what a sacrifice it was, and it's been a huge learning experience. I love the goats, and they're worth it, but I think looking back, I might have gotten a partner to do it with. I think that would take some burden off of just being a single person doing this on my own. So that would be my suggestion is really what does it take to, and same with plants, I mean, same thing. You're not taking any vacations.
How long have you been doing it?
Since last March. It's our first year.
Can you predict the turnout?
I don't know, they're so inspiring. Like even when it's a snowstorm and I'm like looking out the window and like, I don't want to get out of bed this morning. Then I get down to the goats and they're all so happy to see me. And I feel like I have a purpose.
What kind of goats do you have? Do you have Nubians or?
I have a Nubian, Alpine, La Mancha, and Dwarf. So we have the variety. There's 300 breeds of goats in the world, and we just try to show a small handful. All dairy goats, so no fiber goats yet, or meat goats. Some of them might go to meat. And that's the other thing with animals in a city. What do you do with all the boy goats that are born? Because we can't milk them, and we can't keep a ton of goats at the farm. So dairy is naturally part of the meat industry, even with cows, with any milk. You always have boy babies born, and you can't keep them. So one thing is educating our community about sustainable meat. I don't really eat goat, but I guess I might start, because if I'm going to eat meat, it would look like the goats that I grow, because they're so happy. But I would feel good about animals. This is how I want my meat raised, is how we raise our goats. It's amazing. But you know, I have a crew of 15, 12-year-olds that come to the farm every single weekend as youth volunteers, and we have discussions about the goats and what happens to boy babies, and it's a big deal when your neighbors are watching you, and they love these goats, and the goats are all bottle fed, and kids are a part of that process. So it's a really big question. If you're going to do meat animals in a city, it's a lot about values and educating the community on where does your meat come from as you're bottle feeding the goat.
Oh, you know, and then there's like the breeding process. It's happening. The
Yeah.
12-year-olds are there being like, oh, who's Thor gonna breed with today? You know, it's like, it's a very real introduction to all of that.
Oh,
I
yeah.
think it's incredible, you know? So many kids now do not and would not ever think about any of that. And parents are struggling with how do I talk to my kids about where their food comes from? How do I talk to them about, you know, what happens to that chicken if she doesn't make it? You know, how do I do that? Well, you need examples like this. You need these real life examples of things that these kids can engage with, and animals that they can relate to and feel attached to even, and then go through the process of understanding that that is what this means. That is what it means to be a meat eater or a dairy consumer. This is the work that goes into it. And I think that that's true on a much less personal level with your vegetables. You know, Connor has a sort of thing about carrots, but other than that, you know, I think in general we don't have that sort of relationship with vegetables, but we do. But we do have to teach. We do have to teach our kids where all this comes from, and the only way to do it is with their hands and like really experiencing it fully.
And maybe that would also help us all to realize the true value of food and the true cost of it. Because I think that's one of the huge things in our country is that we don't pay for the cost of our food, not the real cost of it. And until we actually get it in our heads that there is cost and value to it, you know, that we've lived in this subsidized world and not looked at the overall cost of something. Everybody here is totally aware of that, things about growing our food in centralized areas and transporting it, not only the cost of that and the fuel, but what are we doing to our environment and everything. So unless we really look at that whole picture and realize that there is cost, and one of the ways to do that is to actually be involved in it. And so all the kids that work with both Lauren and Tabor are learning a lot about, you know, what is actually involved in producing our food. So I think that's, and then adults too are learning that, because most people are pretty removed from it. So
yeah, I was going to say that similar thing, just that we have so many different age groups come to the garden, and it isn't just children. You know, we have, and that's sort of the miracle of it all. We have people that come from all walks of life, of all ages, that are always coming to the gardens to learn something, or to just have an experience, or to experience something that they don't get in their everyday life. And that kind of brings me around to sort of my final thoughts on all of this, which is that you know, before I came to Growing Gardens, I did a lot of research into policy. I was writing about farming and farm to table and all of these sort of ideas people have. And there was always this question of, how do we get our policymakers to understand this? How do we get our government to get involved in this and to care about it? And it brings us around to that sort of quantifiable and not quantifiable aspects of what we do. I think that there's plenty of things that Growing Gardens and Tabor and Catherine do that we can quantify. We know that her 4 goats feed 40 families, their dairy, for 6 months out of the year. We know, and a whole army of volunteers that she keeps well fed. And then we also know the poundage of vegetables that we donate to community food share, and we know how many kids are educated every year. But there's this whole other piece that is so difficult to communicate in any other way than someone coming and experiencing it. And that is the community building. You know, Catherine was saying, I think it was for a grant you were writing or something, and you were saying that the city had spent tens of thousands of dollars on community building programs, like neighborhood block parties and stuff. Well, we are one big community builder. You got people out there that would never encounter each other in any other place, and they're there and they're working together and they're feeling better by the minute. And so that is, I think, the sort of hard thing to pin down, which is why I really think that as much as you can, if you're trying to influence someone, you have to have them experience it. You have to have them, and that's why as farmers and agriculturalists, I think the best thing we can do is invite people to join us. And I think that is sort of, that's sort of my best way of.
And that's not always an easy thing, because some of us that are farmers, that's just sort of contrary to our nature. Because for me at least, and I think for a lot of people, particularly in a more rural setting, but even for me, what I enjoy is being out in nature, being with plants and animals, but not necessarily human animals as much. So sometimes you really have to be committed to wanting to share that and know that to have everything survive, to get things to work better in our community, you have to share that, even if you like your solitude and your relationship, your quiet relationship with your land and everything. So for me, it's sometimes a big struggle, these two know that, about having a lot of people coming on the property. Even though it's a very good thing, it's not necessarily what I would naturally choose, but it's part of realizing that there is a lot of value in people experiencing it. I think Lauren's absolutely right. I tell people about the programs I've worked for years with Growing Gardens. She's totally right. It's the big thing I always tell is that people who would not otherwise have anything to do with each other rub shoulders, dig in the dirt together. That's how we all learn about each other and have some hope for peace and everything in this world, is to get to know each other. So what a great place for that. So I always have to keep that in mind when I'm thinking, what are all these people doing?
We know that her 4 goats feed 40 families, their dairy for 6 months out of the year. We know, and a whole army of volunteers that she keeps well fed. And then we also know the poundage of vegetables that we donate to community food share, and we know how many kids are educated every year. But there's this whole other piece that is so difficult to communicate in any other way than someone coming and experiencing it. And that is the community building. Catherine was saying, I think it was for a grant you were writing or something, and you were saying that the city had spent tens of thousands of dollars on community building programs, like neighborhood block parties and stuff. Well, we are one big community builder. You got people out there that would never encounter each other in any other place, and they're there and they're working together and they're feeling better by the minute. And so that is, I think, the sort of hard thing to pin down, which is why I really think that as much as you can, if you're trying to influence someone, you have to have them experience it. You have to have them, and that's why as farmers and agriculturalists, I think the best thing we can do is invite people to join us. And I think that is sort of, that's sort of my best way of.
And that's not always an easy thing, because some of us that are farmers, that's just sort of contrary to our nature. Because for me at least, and I think for a lot of people, particularly in a more rural setting, but even for me, what I enjoy is being out in nature, being with plants and animals, but not necessarily human animals as much.
We've got just a couple of minutes left. I'm going to give Tabor a chance to say something, but do you guys have any questions? Yeah.
I just was wondering, Tabor, you mentioned the co-op model for urban ag, and I was just wondering, like, why you haven't implemented that, even though you said you would like to, and what that looks like, and how you would recommend starting that.
Well, I've seen it mostly with chickens.
Yeah.
And basically, I mean, I guess I'm not talking about like a legal entity of a co-op,
Yeah.
which you could do too. We're a nonprofit just for tax reasons. And I've seen, the chickens live at one house, and then neighbors come every day and you split the chicken feed, you split some veterinary bills, you split costs, but then you all benefit from the chicken eggs. And you all have days that you come and care for the chickens. Haven't implemented that. I do have volunteers that come almost every day for almost every shift, because it's more about the subtlety of animals at this point, and when it's so new, like if I'm not there every day making sure a goat doesn't have a stuffy nose that turns into pneumonia, maybe chickens are a little less needy, but dairy animals have a lot of mineral requirements that they would normally get from browsing, and we do browse our animals, but they don't just eat everything, they're actually incredibly sensitive. So at this point, when I'm still learning the herd, it can't really work where I'm not there every day monitoring. And especially sharing the land with Catherine, it doesn't work for her to have random people just coming on who she doesn't know. We share a space, I have a key. So I haven't implemented it because I guess if I did, it would be one partner. There is a Jewish goat dairy near town that did do a co-op model. And basically everyone in the model would have a milking night. It introduces disease. You're all doing it differently. So there's a couple things with milking animals that make it harder to do a co-op. Maybe you don't realize that the other person fed the goats the grain already, they bloat and die. You give them different amounts of food. You don't see their subtleties every day. But I would, I guess looking back, I would have done it with one partner that was willing to take on equal being there together so we could watch it happen. But having a new person in every day, or even, it just wouldn't work with the subtlety of the animals and the landowner relationship. It really there needs to be somebody there consistently, a manager watching the changes.
And I have to say that kind of goes for plants too. So most things need some person that's a consistent presence, because you do, with plants it's the same thing, you have to notice. And you don't maybe notice those subtleties unless you're checking things frequently. So But that doesn't mean you can't have a cooperative thing. It just means that somehow there has to be some consistency and oversight and things, so.
Very organized.
Yes, but I think the main thing when we talked about this before is that I don't think most people realize what it takes to actually be a farmer as far as the commitment. It makes it very difficult to participate in what I think the lifestyle is of most people. I don't know what the lifestyle is of most people because I don't have it. Because I don't take vacations and things like that, so I don't know. And I don't go. But I think that's why it seems more reasonable to think if there's a way to have some kind of a co-op type thing, it would mesh better with what's a more typical urban lifestyle. So it's certainly worth looking at.
Oh, thank you all for being here today. It was really, it's so awesome and inspiring to see all these people interested in urban agriculture with such great questions, and it just gives me hope, I guess, for the future of our urban system.